America is built on a narrative of immigrants. I'm sure that growing up, you heard more often that America was built on its immigrants more so than it was built on its slaves. And that has really twisted our understanding of how America came to be. The relationship between immigration and slavery is an important one, but it's one that we usually put in two separate boxes. Immigration, the stories of our families and our grandparents, and slavery, a horrific and brutal system that most of us can't even imagine and think must have been wrong. People must have known it was wrong, and we're glad we're done with it. America actually was built on the intertwining of the two. And to understand who we are today and our definition of what it means to be in America today is to understand something about the decisions that were made, not by the individual families, but by the political and economic structures that guided both how slavery came to be, how slavery ended, how immigrants came to this country, who we decided to let in, and who we then decided we didn't want and kept out. Long time ago, if you remember, our country was a colony. It was a set of colonies. People who came to America were just really moving from the same country. When America became what it was an intriguing mix of people. And even at the time, we had Scotch and Irish, people from the UK and France, Germans, and there was a mix of people who were understood to be Americans. And the question became early on, what does it mean to be an American? There's a famous set of letters written by a guy named J. Hector Jean de Crevecoeur, and he wrote a letter about describing what does it mean to be an American today. It was widely influential because he expressed what many people believed at the time, and that is that even though America had combined a group of people from different nations, that America was attracting the best of these nations. That America was attracting, yes, people from Germany and France, the Dutch, the Irish, but that we somehow benefited by a mixture of the best qualities of all of these nations. That America was creating a superior nation because it was creating a new person, a new race, that there was the new American man. But what's most fascinating to me is that the presumption of who the new American man was always presumed to be white. These letters never talked about blacks. It never talked about the many Africans that came from many nations and tribes. It didn't talk about the variety of languages, religions, cultural practices. It failed to talk about the forcible bringing over who were shipped bodies in these places, dark and dank. They weren't even expected to survive. Accountants who managed the finances of slave ships knew that they were going to lose cargo. We brought millions of Africans to the United States. Africans who were here, some of them for generations before any immigrant ever showed up. And yet, when early Americans thought of who was a true American, they only thought of a mixture of white. Eventually, as we move through the 19th century, we see a continued increase in immigration. Depending on the social, political, and economic circumstances of what was going on in other countries, many people did come to America because they thought that they could have a better life. What's interesting is that many of those white people came as slaves themselves. Even if we call them indentured servants, what we forget is at the same time that we had black slaves, we also had white slavery. Those white slaves also put themselves under bondage. In fact, right up until the middle of the Civil War, there was still a debate about whether slavery should be expanded and that we should include whites as slaves as well as black in order for the blessings of slavery to be extended to all people. This idea of what it meant to be white and black was crafted out of beliefs of black slaves. Enslaved blacks never had the opportunity really to earn their freedom. Enslaved blacks were always going to be property. Enslaved blacks were like, your house. You just used it. You borrowed money off of it. It was worth something. And if it grew in value, you could sell it to someone else. What was better about enslaved blacks is that you could breed them. You could actually put them together and make more, and thereby make more money. Enslaved blacks were in a completely different category from the indentured white slaves, because white slaves not only could earn their freedom, they were actually given compensation for the time in which they were under slavery. When emancipation eventually came, blacks were not given the same opportunities and privileges as whites. Even the lowest level white immigrant immediately had more opportunities, greater chance of becoming full-fledged citizens, and also being able to vote or take political office, or even be able to go to court and have their cases heard. Even free blacks couldn't serve as judges, jury, or even witnesses in a trial, but whites could. So when the 19th century passed along to the latter times in terms of the 1880s, 1890s, what we find is that more and more whites came from other countries. They came to the United States because the United States wanted them. If you may remember some about your high school history class, we know that there was the Louisiana Purchase. We know that the expansion of the West was happening. What you may not have been taught in high school is that at this time we had also been to war with Mexico and taken over an incredible amount of land. Most of what we consider the West Coast is actually something that was part of Mexico at one time. Several of our states began as Mexican territory, all the way up through modern-day Canada. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is something that allowed us to immediately take over land and adopt a place where Mexicans had called home. Those Mexicans who were living on those lands were told that they were going to have rights. They were told that they were going to be treated just like American citizens. But would you be surprised to say that we didn't honor those commitments? Those Mexicans who now became Americans overnight were people who weren't able to establish their land claims. They weren't able to get employment. They weren't able to have mobility. These were people who were quickly displaced, and they knew that the United States really didn't think of them as true Americans. And so many of them moved down and moved across the border in order to be in a place where they could belong. So in this new vast land, partly as a result of the Louisiana Purchase, partly as a result of the takeover of land from Mexico, the United States wanted to build a strong nation, and rather than taking free blacks and moving them over, they actively recruited more whites from Europe. Even the federal government partnered with private businesses, sending diplomats and representatives to go and say, we have work for you, we have places for you, we have land for you. Have you ever heard of the Homestead Act or the Oklahoma Land Rush? This idea of people who run through into the West and take over this land, and they're given land for free. This benefit was given to white settlers. The newest white immigrant from Sweden could immediately have property, whereas the black, formerly enslaved American who had been there and whose parents and grandparents may have been there still had nothing. See, the immigration story of America intertwines with that of slavery because we welcomed white immigrants. We wanted white immigrants. Our country was largely built on white immigrants. And it was done so because we wanted to foster an America that was built on the right kind of person. Once we got to the latter part of the 19th century and moved into the 20th century, America's open borders got itself into some trouble. People started to see that we were bringing people that we didn't quite like as much. Yes, we wanted Europeans, but instead of the Northern and Western Europeans that we thought of as strong, hardy, industrious, we started to get Southern and Eastern Europeans. These are the Greeks and the Italians. These are Jews, like from Russia, the Polish. These were the kinds of people that America was not quite sure of. The Irish, after the potato famine, the Catholic Irish started to come, and they weren't the right religion. These are people who came that were questionable at best. We weren't quite sure who they were. We weren't really sure if these were the kinds of people that we were comfortable with. And the numbers were so great that they overtook the number of immigrants that came from the north and the west. And so we had darker-skinned people who were in greater numbers than the lighter-skinned people from before. Well, we couldn't have that. So Congress acted. The president, our elected officials, wide public sentiment said we have to do something. We have to control what kind of people we come into the United States. The government even set up a commission called the Dillingham Commission in 1907. It pulled together a lot of sort of pseudo-scientific reports about different kinds of people, how they lived, how they ate, their lifestyles, their hygiene, whether they were good workers or not. Could they be trusted? Is this the kind of person that we want in America? This kind of reporting was built on notions that were questionable at best, but they were very authoritative at the time. The study of eugenics that had developed was a study of biology, human biology. It was presumed that we could typify the kinds of people that there were all over the world. There were good kinds of people, and there were bad kinds of people. There were people, nationalities, backgrounds, racial groups that had higher incidence of mental illness. They were more likely to be criminals. These were the kind of people who didn't know how to get a job. They were lazy and dirty. These are the kinds of people that we definitely didn't want. Eugenics was a worldwide scientific effort. Every community in every nation had a scientific cadre of intellectuals that sought to establish who were the best kind of people and what kind of people should we have in our nation. It was believed that in order to build a strong nation, you needed to build it on strong genetics. And so the kind of people we had to be people who were genetically the best and the highest quality and the hardiest and the ones who were going to give us the strongest nation possible. We usually associate that with Hitler's Nazi Germany, but most people don't know that Hitler's Nazi Germany, the ideas were actually from America. America had developed some of these ideas, and they were quickly taken up and expanded on into a national system that we now know as the concentration camps and the horror-filled ovens where they systematically killed people because they were unwanted and unnecessary and certainly not something to build a country on. The United States decided to enact immigration policies in order to keep the wrong people out of the country and yet have the right people keep coming. So out of a series of legislative acts, particularly in the 1910s and 1920s, the United States established its strongest, most sweeping, and most authoritative immigration bills. In 1924, the National Origins Act specifically stated that we would allow 2% quotas of people based on the number of people that were already in America, that we would only accept a fraction of the immigration that had been coming, but that quota would be established based on the kinds of people that we wanted. Now, the surge of the kinds of people that we didn't want from Southern and Eastern Europe had started coming in the 1890s, in the 1900s, and the 1910s. Up to 500,000 of these Eastern and Southern Europeans were coming, compared to less than 100,000 of those that were the right kind of people. So in order to establish the quotas to be able to get the right kind of people, the United States established its figures based on the 1890 census. In other words, it went back 30 years in order to establish numbers before the surge of people that we did not want in the United States. Now, the United States also didn't have certain kinds of people already in the United States because of legislation we had already enacted earlier that century. The Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 is the most important and sweeping act because it targeted a particular group of people. Californians did not like the Chinese. They believed that the Chinese were taking away jobs that poor whites could get. It was a threat to their economic survival. And so the Chinese, who had been building the railroads, doing agriculture and mining, the Chinese who had been instrumental in building the Western industries, the Chinese were targeted specifically out of political pressure on the part of poor white Californians. And Washington, D.C. listened, and they said, no more Chinese. They deported Chinese, they stripped them of any property rights that they had, and the Chinese were no longer welcomed in the United States. It's not as if the Chinese were a large group of people, but they were significant enough to be noticed. And what's interesting to me is that had we not had a restrictive policy excluding the Chinese completely from entering the United States, surely we would have had a larger Asian component in the United States, and we would have seen that as a more integral part of our nation. No, by the time we were going with the National Origins Act in 1924, we had very few Chinese in the United States to begin with. So if you set up a national origins quota based on an 1890 census of a group of people who really aren't there, you're now limiting the number of Chinese that come into the United States legally to a few dozen at best. In fact, in the United States, the Chinese were not allowed to be American citizens until 1952. Now, when we go into the 20th century, what we see is that because the United States was very effective at limiting those who are from the South and the East, the darker skinned and those who were perceived to be dirtier and less desirable, we were able to increase the number of people who were the right kind of whites. The kind of people that we wanted, the white people that we wanted in the United States, became the sort of generational, the mixture of people who began to blend together so that children and grandchildren who no longer spoke German, people who no longer knew their Dutch heritage, and with no fresh migration happening because of changes politically and economically, we now had people who only understood themselves to be American. It was in those years, between those mid-1920s up through the 1950s, that we really crafted a white American identity. This is where you get those stories of those heroic immigrants who had come in the past, built some sort of a business or worked hard in a factory, were able to establish a home, and were able then to grow and become who we now see as these proud, patriotic Americans. The 1950s was the lowest point of foreign immigration that we had in American history. It is the time at which whites became white. And who was excluded? We know that for those who think of the 50s with great nostalgia, we know that this was a time when blacks were still excluded from many public schools. We know it was a time when blacks were excluded from occupations and weren't able to go to any school that they wanted. We know that they were already being denied loans and unable to just live wherever they wanted. We know that the 1950s was actually a quite oppressive time in which you had things like a water cooler where whites could only drink from one and blacks only from another. It's that kind of world where whiteness prevailed. It was a time when radio and television grew. It was a time when the images of what it meant to be American were defined as a white, suburban, middle-class, family-oriented home. That's a time that really was crafted because of immigration policies that had neglected certain kinds of people and also privileged immigration stories over the stories of blacks who had been trying to make it, blacks who were still struggling through issues of civil rights, blacks who were still fighting just to sit at a lunch counter, just to have lunch. So when we move into the latter part of the 20th century, we may talk about the civil rights movement, and we may be proud of some things that have happened at that time. But the civil rights movement was a desperate attempt simply to acknowledge some of the historic injustices that blacks had faced and that over generations had never really been addressed. In comparison with white immigrants who had been warmly welcomed, had been able to spread across the United States in suburban homes and to be able to move up in education, build capital, pass that along to their children. By the time we get to the latter part of the 20th century, we have a very proud history of achievement on the part of white immigrants, at the same time that we have continued oppressions of those who had been denied the same opportunities on the part of blacks. You see, whites became white over time, and they became white because they knew that they didn't want to be black. The most recent immigrant to America knew that there was a racial hierarchy, and they knew that they needed to make sure that they were not thought of as black. Over the years, Asians, Middle Eastern, other people had gone to the Supreme Court to make sure that they were legally classified as white in order to be able to access the benefits of being white. There are certain things that you could only do if you were white. And so by the process of steadily integrating more and more people, Italians became white, Jews became white, the Irish became white. All of those movements to establishing a grander sense of whiteness in America is really built on the oppression of blacks who had been systematically denied full participation in America. Today we're facing something similar, and that is with the southern border. When we look at Mexico, we've always had tensions between the U.S. and Mexican border. The tensions are there because American businesses have always relied on cheap labor. American businesses at the border relied on seasonal labor to come and do mostly agricultural work, but other kinds of work as well. And they would take Mexican migrants who would move up and back across a porous border in order to take on jobs. American businesses had no problem hiring these people, sometimes legally, sometimes illegally. When the federal government became more serious about policing the southern border, it actually became a problem. Why was it a problem? It was because the businesses wanted to continue to hire labor and didn't want to get in trouble for hiring illegally. Cheap labor would take over jobs that unions had sought to control. Cheap labor would threaten a number of different economic interests. And so it was the United States that began to say, all right, we're going to set up a guest worker program called the Bracero Program from 1942 to 1965. This program legally allowed a certain number of guest workers who would be official in coming in. They limited how many, but nevertheless, this is what allowed for a pattern of migration that up until then had been informal and made it more formal. When the Bracero program ended in 1965, what you have is Mexicans who were no longer legally allowed to come and businesses who were still willing to hire them. This is the fundamental thing that is going on at the southern border and has for a long time. American businesses want to hire cheap Mexican labor. Mexicans don't have many choices. Even their own government was encouraging their own people to go to the United States, earn money, and boost the Mexican economy. Out of that heritage of having a continued attempt to use that cheap Mexican labor, the policing of the border made more and more Mexicans illegally here, but they would criminalize the Mexican worker, not the businesses that hire them. And so even today, when you look at who is blamed for the immigration problem at the southern border crossings on the part of Mexicans continue to happen because they know that they can still get work in the United States. And yet, who is blamed? The federal government has very little interest in pursuing businesses. The federal government has very little interest in actually examining the hiring practices of businesses. Anecdotal stories will say that when you're looking for where false papers are coming from that allow illegal immigrants to work in the United States, anecdotal stories will say it's actually those businesses that are providing those papers for those people. And yet we criminalize the individuals. As the border tightens, rather than having a porous back and forth movement between Mexico and America and then back, we find more and more people coming into the United States and unable to go home. The tighter the border, the larger the illegal, undocumented population of Mexicans becomes in the United States, because they have now made a commitment to come, made a risky journey to be here, returning money, often help to support their families, but they're unable to go back. The crisis at the border is not so much because we have a lot of people who are trying to work against the system. It's because we have interpreted the problem of immigration as a criminal issue rather than as a labor issue. Once upon a time, immigration was under the Department of Labor. Now it's under the Department of Justice. When you see immigration through the lens of labor, a lot of things begin to change. We start to think about what would it take for us to incorporate these people, and what would we do to be able to allow them to work, and how could they serve our American businesses and help to build our economy? But when you see it only through the lens of criminality, then it only becomes how many people can we get through a court? How many beds do we need in these detention centers? And who is it that can build these detention centers, and how can we pay for those detention centers? Mexican migration has actually expanded the prison complex in the United States. For those concerned about the mass incarceration of blacks, especially black men in America, we might look at our immigration to see how that has also fed into the very same system and promoting the same injustices. Look, we are in a really interesting time. We all talk about immigration in different ways, and we all have different ideas and beliefs about what immigration is. Our history says differently. Our history says that immigration is something that the United States has sought to manage over time, that the decisions that we've made have actually fostered a belief about who is a true American and who doesn't belong, that the stories of immigration that we tell are very much incomplete because they center on a heroism of the kinds of people that we think we should have, and not necessarily on that desperation of people who come because they're just trying to survive another day. Since 1965 in the Hart-Celler Act, we now have more people here from Asia and Latin America, and they're legal. Legal immigration from Asia and Latin America is a deliberate policy change on the part of Congress because we were fighting the Cold War. We wanted to drain communist countries, and we wanted to expand our own country. And at the time, we thought that an open-armed approach to the world was good for our country. Well, until the percentage of the foreign-born went up so high that it was no longer something that we could ignore. You see, people who are recent immigrants, those who have historically been the ones that are thought of as most foreign, Asians and Latinos, these are the ones who are moving more and more into rural communities across America. These are the ones who are now stretching north away from the border and are moving into the Midwest. The diffusion of the recent immigrant population has grown, and that means that now, more than ever before, white people will see color in ways that they never saw in their whole lives. That sense of understanding how a historically white community, white schools, white churches, white workplaces, white places like the library, PTA meetings, the grocery store, is now you see a little bit of color. Now you see some people who maybe don't speak English as their first language. That percentage has gone up, and only one other time has it gone up to this percentage. About 15%. Do you know the last time in America when we edged 15% foreign born? It was exactly at the same time, 1924, that we decided that we needed to restrict immigration by putting quotas and radically restricting the number of people who came, especially the people that we did not want. We've reached that same point today. The United States is filled with people who have a lot of anxiety, that America is not the America that they recognized. Well, there's a reason for it. America has always fostered a particular view of the kind of person that we thought was truly American. Even though the immigration policies that have led to the rise of Asians and Latinos has been here for now almost 50 years, we are still figuring out who are these people? What do they mean for our families? Can we trust them? Immigrant communities themselves know better. They know that they care about family just like you do. They know that they want to work just like you do. They know that they want their kids to have a great education and a great future just like you do. But we are in a time when we need to reconsider, how are we understanding ourselves? Who will we welcome into our United States so that we can embrace a broader sense of citizenship, of community, a sense of belonging, to really be able to see that we can be a strong and unified country, even if it's people that we may not immediately recognize, that this is the America that we have, and it's America that can be stronger and stronger as we move forward.